It was October 1869. Highgate Cemetery, London, past midnight. 4 men stand around an open grave, their faces lit by a bonfire that shouldn't be there. One of them is Charles Augustus Howell, art dealer, con artist, and blackmailer. He'll later inspire the Sherlock Holmes story, The Adventures of Charles Augustus Milverton. Another man is the solicitor Henry Virtue Tebbs. The other 2 are gravediggers, paid handsomely for their discretion. They've been digging for hours, and the coffin is coming up. This is illegal, by the way, technically. The grave belongs to the Rossetti family. Gabriel Rossetti was buried here in 1854, and his daughter-in-law 7 years later. But Gabriel's widow, Frances, the owner of the plot, who should be the one to give the okay on this, has no idea this is happening. Neither do his daughters. The Home Secretary himself bent the rules to make this exhumation possible, all because one man, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, painter, poet, and widower, wants something back. It's a manuscript of poems, bound in gray calf leather the way she'd asked him to have it bound. He'd placed it in her coffin himself and tucked it beside her, and he'd written her a note saying that since she was gone, he had no more use for them. But that was 1862. This is 1869, and he's since changed his mind. He needs the poems, needs to publish, needs the money. The coffin comes up, and they pry it open. Years later, Howell will tell people that her body was perfectly preserved, that her hair had kept growing, filling the entire coffin with copper-colored coils that glowed in the firelight like a living flame. He'll say she looked like she was sleeping, not like someone who'd been dead for 7 years. It's a lie. It's biologically impossible. And yet this lie, this specific, Gothic, romantic lie, will follow her through history, becoming one more layer of myth plastered over whoever she actually was. They take the manuscript. The pages are stained, apparently eaten through by a worm. Another detail that will get repeated, embellished, and made symbolic. They take what they can salvage, and then they close the coffin and put her back in the ground. But she doesn't stay there. Not really. Because here's the thing about Elizabeth Siddal, the Pre-Raphaelite model and muse. She's been exhumed over and over again. Every few decades, someone digs her up and decides she's something different. In the 1880s, she's an erotic ghost. In the 1920s, she's a frigid hysteric. In the 1960s, she's a proto-groupie, and in the 1980s, she's a victim of patriarchal oppression. Or maybe a proto-feminist, depending on who's writing. And every single time, we think we finally figured out who she really was. But here's what I think. Maybe we keep getting her wrong because we need her to be something. The doomed muse, the tragic beauty, the woman who died for art. We need her to mean something, so we make her mean whatever we want her to mean. This is a story about a woman who drowned in her own legend. Actually, that's not quite right. She didn't drown, though you've definitely seen the painting where it looks like she does. I'm Emma Laramie, and this is Verso. We move now to London, somewhere between 1849 and 1850. Sources differ, which, as you'll see, is a running theme. Here's what we know for certain. At some point in this window, a young woman named Elizabeth Eleanor Siddal started modeling for a group of artists who called themselves the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. She was around 20 years old, and she had red hair, the kind that would have been considered deeply unfortunate at the time. She was tall, thin, pale, with hooded eyes, and by the beauty standards of the 1840s, which were all about Queen Victoria's peaches and cream roundness, Elizabeth Siddal would have been considered plain at best, actively ugly at worst. But within 2 years, she'd be one of the most painted women in England. And within a decade, she'd helped change beauty standards forever. Pale, willowy, red-haired, and medieval-looking, that became the aesthetic. She made it happen just by existing, just by being painted over and over again as doomed literary heroines. But how did it start? How did she meet them? Here's where it gets interesting. We have at least 3 different origin stories, and the one you believe shapes everything that comes after. There's version 1, where a young painter named Walter Deverell is walking past a shop on Cranbourne Street. He's maybe running an errand for his mother, maybe just taking a walk. But through a window, he sees a young woman working. It's Elizabeth Siddal, employed as a milliner's assistant. And he's struck by her face, the angles of it, the strangeness, the way she looks like she stepped out of a medieval painting. He can't just walk in and talk to her. That would be wildly inappropriate. So he goes home and tells his mother about this extraordinary face he's seen. And his mother, Mrs. Deverell, a respectable woman, the kind whose presence makes everything proper, goes to the shop to talk to the owner, Mrs. Tozer, and to Elizabeth herself. It's a hard sell. Modeling in 1850 is synonymous with prostitution. It's not something respectable women do. But Mrs. Deverell is so respectable, so reassuring, that she convinces them. And then she makes the trip to Southwark, to 8 Kent Place, to convince Elizabeth's mother. In this version, Elizabeth is discovered. She's an object of beauty who happens to be in the right place at the right time. She's passive and she's lucky. And then there's version 2. A poet named William Allingham goes to the milliner's shop to meet a woman he knows, a co-worker of Elizabeth's named Jeanette, whom he's smitten with. Elizabeth is working there too, and when Allingham and Jeanette leave to walk home, Elizabeth joins them. Allingham doesn't particularly like her. He'll later write that her, quote, pale face, abundant red hair, and long thin limbs were strange and affecting, never beautiful in my eyes, end quote. But he's friends with the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, including Walter Deverell, who's looking for a model to pose as Viola in his painting of Twelfth Night. So, Allingham mentions her. Deverell goes to see her himself, sends his mother to negotiate, and the same story unfolds. In this version, Elizabeth is still discovered, but more awkwardly. She's not in a window like an object on display. She's third-wheeling on someone else's romantic walk, slightly in the way. And then, version 3 comes from an obituary in the Sheffield Telegraph published shortly after her death. It claims to be based on her own account of how it happened. In it, Elizabeth Siddal shows her own drawings to Walter Deverell's father, who was connected to the Government School of Design. But in this version, she's the one making the first move. She's showing her artwork, demonstrating her talent, and asking to be introduced to artists who might need models. In this version, she has agency. She's not discovered, she's strategizing. She knows modeling pays better than millinery, about 5 shillings a day versus 24 pounds a year, and she knows her family needs money. She's making a calculated decision about her career. But here's the thing. We don't know which version is true. And that matters because if she was discovered, passive and lucky, she's one kind of person. If she discovered herself and actively sought out opportunity, she's someone else entirely. And here's what I think. The discovered in the milliner's window story is just a little too perfect, a little too pre-Raphaelite romantic, the beautiful peasant girl elevated by art. And we know that at least one member of the Brotherhood, William Holman Hunt, circulated that version, so clearly they had a vested interest in the romance of it. But the version where she approached the School of Design herself, that one only appears once, but it comes from an obituary that claims to be quoting her own account. And it fits with other things we know about her. That she was described by people who actually knew her as proud, willful, headstrong, and even ungrateful. Nobody who actually spent time with her described her as the meek person she came to be known as. That characterization came later, from the paintings that Dante Gabriel Rossetti made of her, which show her resting or reading or dozing, all being passive and delicate. So I'm inclined to believe version 3, but I'm telling you all 3 because the gaps in her story, the contradictions, the things we don't know and can't know, those are important. Every generation fills those gaps in differently based on what they need her to be. So let's talk about what it meant for Elizabeth Siddal to become a model in 1850. As I hinted at, it meant social suicide. Her family was working class, yes. Her father, Charles Siddal, ran a cutlery-making business. They lived in Southwark, which wasn't fashionable, but it wasn't a slum either. They were respectable. They went to church, Congregationalist, deeply religious. They had aspirations. Charles Siddal spent enormous amounts of money and time on a lawsuit trying to recover supposedly lost titles to ancestral lands in Derbyshire. It was a complete waste. Eventually, Elizabeth's sister Clara would throw all of the papers relating to it into the fire just to end the family's suffering over it. But it tells you something about their self-image. They believed they'd come down in the world, believed they deserved better. And modeling? That was not necessarily better. Because here's what made it scandalous. Modeling meant being alone in a room with a man who wasn't your husband or your father or your brother. It meant holding still while he looked at you, studied you, touched his brush to canvas, trying to capture the curve of your neck or the angle of your jaw. And people assumed, even if it wasn't true, that it meant posing nude. Elizabeth almost certainly never modeled nude, not for the Pre-Raphaelites and not for Rossetti. But the assumption was always there. Modeling equals prostitution. That's just what people thought. So why did her parents let her do it? There was the money element. Elizabeth could make in a day what she made in a week at the milliner's. Her older brother, Charles Jr., was one of the family's breadwinners, but he was getting sick. He would die of tuberculosis in early 1852. So the money mattered. And Elizabeth? She was 20 years old. She had artistic ambitions. She made her own drawings and sketches, and had found a piece of Tennyson's poetry once printed on a scrap of newspaper that had been wrapped around some butter. It was just a fragment of words, but she'd fallen in love with it, tracked down more of his work, wanted to be an artist and a poet herself. This was her way in, so she took it. Now, before we get any deeper into the specifics of Elizabeth's story, it's important that you understand what the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was to understand why Elizabeth Siddal mattered so much to them. In 1848, 7 young men, including John Everett Millais, William Holman Hunt, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti, formed a secret society. They were all between the ages of 19 and 23, and they were students at the Royal Academy who were bored out of their minds with how art was being taught. The Academy wanted them to paint like Raphael, safe, classical, and idealized. The Pre-Raphaelites wanted to go back to before Raphael, to the medieval period when paintings were full of bright color and specific detail and meaning. So they made a pact. They'd paint subjects from modern life, from literature, and from the Bible. They would paint directly from nature with obsessive attention to detail. They'd use vibrant colors, and they'd sign their work with 3 mysterious letters: P.R.B. For about 2 years, people wondered what PRB meant. Then, in 1850, the secret got out. It stood for Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. The critics destroyed them. These arrogant kids thought they knew better than Raphael. Even Charles Dickens, whose word was basically gospel at the time, publicly trashed them. Until John Ruskin, the most important art critic in England, the man who could make or break an artist's career with a single review, came to their defense. When he wrote 2 letters to the Times in 1851 praising the Pre-Raphaelites, everything changed. Suddenly, they were legitimate. This was the world Elizabeth Siddal was stepping into in 1850. A group of idealistic young men desperate to change art forever. And they needed models who looked right for their needs. Not conventionally pretty, but spiritually and physically appropriate to the subjects they were painting. Elizabeth, with her medieval face, her strange beauty, and her willingness to hold still for hours, she was exactly what they needed. The first painting she modeled for was Walter Deverell's Twelfth Night, where she posed as Viola. When it was exhibited in 1850, people noticed her. That face, those eyes. Then William Holman Hunt asked her to model, then John Everett Millais. And then Dante Gabriel Rossetti saw her, and everything changed again. When Elizabeth Siddal met Dante Gabriel Rossetti, she was 21 and he was 22. It was probably late 1850 or early 1851, but sources, as always, differ. But here's what you need to understand about Rossetti. He'd built his entire personality around being in love with a dead woman. Not a contemporary dead woman, a semi-fictional one. Beatrice Portinari from Dante Alighieri's work. Rossetti was born Charles Gabriel Dante Rossetti. As a teenager, he switched the order to Dante Gabriel from Gabriel Dante and dropped Charles entirely. He was that obsessed. He spent time translating Dante Alighieri's poetry into English, painted scenes from his work, and he structured his entire understanding of love around this one story. Dante meets Beatrice when she's 9 years old. He loves her, but he never tells her. He watches her get married to someone else. She dies young. He spends the rest of his life writing about her, immortalizing her, loving her more perfectly in art than he ever was brave enough to do in life. Rossetti read this and thought, yes, that's what love is. It's impossible and painful and best experienced through art rather than actual life. So when he met Elizabeth Siddal, what do you think he did? He made her into his own Beatrice. By 1851, they were understood to be a couple, and by 1852, he'd convinced her to stop modeling for the others and pose exclusively for him. This was a financially precarious position for her to be in. She had been making decent money posing for Deverell and Hunt and Millais, but now she was dependent on Rossetti's commissions, and Rossetti was famously terrible with money. But he drew her constantly. She became his subject, his muse, and his obsession. Ford Madox Brown, one of Rossetti's closest friends, wrote in his diary that when Rossetti first saw Elizabeth, quote, he felt his destiny was defined, end quote. And then he wrote, why does he not marry her? Good question, Ford. There are various theories for why not. Class and money were 2 of them, both of which were plausible but have gaping holes in their reasoning. More likely to me is that Rossetti did love her, but he never really wanted to be married. Not to her, not to anyone. So he stalled. They were together for 10 years before they married. 10 years. But in the early weeks of 1852, before she had signed her modeling career away to Rossetti, John Everett Millais was painting Ophelia, Shakespeare's doomed maiden driven mad by Hamlet's rejection of her, who drowns herself in a river while gathering flowers. Elizabeth was to be the model. To get the scene right, to capture how fabric moves in water and how a body floats and how light plays on the surface, Millais had Elizabeth lie in a bathtub filled with water, and he placed lamps underneath it to keep it warm. But one day, completely absorbed in his work, Millais didn't notice when the lamps went out, and Elizabeth, lying in the increasingly cold water, didn't complain. She just kept posing, kept holding still, because that's what models did. They endured. But by the time Millais realized what had happened, she'd been lying in cold water for hours, and she developed a severe cold. This happened just weeks after her brother Charles died of tuberculosis. She'd spend almost all of her free time at his bedside watching him waste away, so she was already grieving, already exhausted. And then she lay in a cold bathtub for hours to create an image of a woman drowning. Her father, Charles, notoriously litigious, always looking for a legal battle, threatened Millais with a lawsuit for £50 in damages. Elizabeth recovered from the cold, but many mark it as prophetic for the rest of her life, which would be defined by illness. The painting became one of the most famous images in Pre-Raphaelite art. Ophelia floating in the water, red hair spreading around her like a halo, flowers in her hands and woven in her dress, her face pale and perfect and already gone. William Rossetti, Dante's brother, said it was the painting that looked most like Elizabeth. Quote, "More like Lizzie than any other picture," he wrote. It is the best-known image of her, and it's an image of death, of a woman who loved too much, who went mad from rejection, and who drowned herself in sorrow. All things Elizabeth would eventually experience. It was not long after this that Rossetti asked her to pose for him exclusively, and it was around this time that Rossetti started mentioning her poor health in his letters. In August 1852, he writes to his sister Christina to say that he's visiting Hastings, where Elizabeth is convalescing after that cold, and after that, her illness becomes a recurring theme in his correspondence. By 1854, things were starting to fray. Rossetti's father died that spring, and Rossetti refused to deal with his grief. He just threw himself into work, into Elizabeth, into anything that would distract him. And Elizabeth, sensing his need, became what he needed, the patient who required care, the damsel who needed saving. She had started taking laudanum for her mysterious chronic illness, some kind of condition that caused her pain and nausea and loss of appetite. Laudanum was essentially the Victorian version of aspirin, a mixture of opium and alcohol that you could buy at any pharmacy and that was supposedly meant to treat a myriad of things from coughs to insomnia to generalized pain. And it worked beautifully until you needed more and more. That autumn, Rossetti took her to Hastings again to convalesce. They stayed for 2 months, and friends noted that it seemed to be one of the happiest times in their relationship. Some biographers think that this may have been when he proposed, although there is no precise proof. It would have been strategic timing. With his father just dead, there was a year-long mourning period where he couldn't have gotten married anyway. He could promise her everything without having to deliver on his promises. Eventually, they returned to London, and no wedding plans materialized. The following year, in 1855, John Ruskin, that same critic who'd made the Pre-Raphaelites legitimate, started giving Elizabeth an allowance, £150 a year in exchange for all the drawings and paintings she produced. He believed in her immensely, and he told her, quote, "The plain hard fact is that I think you have genius. That I don't think there is much genius in the world, and I want to keep what there is in it," end quote. This was extraordinary because Ruskin had also told Rossetti, quote, "You are a conceited monkey thinking your pictures are right when I tell you positively they are wrong," end quote. And as a critic, he was exceptionally influential, so his belief in Elizabeth's talent mattered. But it also created a strange situation. If Elizabeth married Rossetti, she'd have to give up the allowance because a married woman couldn't accept payments from a man who wasn't her husband, and Rossetti couldn't really afford to replace that income. So she had money, she had independence, and she was making art, drawing, painting, and writing poetry. For a brief window, it seemed like maybe she didn't need him to marry her after all. And that's when he started cheating. Back in 1850, William Holman Hunt, one of the core members of the Brotherhood, had found his own muse, a young woman named Annie Miller. Unlike Elizabeth, Annie had no illusions about her class. She was working class, she was gorgeous, she was sexual, and she knew it. Hunt had decided to improve her. He paid for her education, for her elocution lessons, and he tried to mold her into someone suitable to marry. Then, in 1854, he left for the Middle East for 2 years, expecting her to wait chastely for his return. Spoiler alert, she did not wait chastely for his return. And then suddenly, Elizabeth wasn't the only model in the Pre-Raphaelite circle anymore. She wasn't special. She was replaceable. Elizabeth hated Annie on sight. And she was right to worry, because while Hunt was away, Rossetti had an affair with her. This wasn't just a betrayal of Elizabeth, it was a betrayal of one of his closest friends. It caused a huge rift in the Brotherhood. And it devastated Elizabeth, who now knew for certain that Rossetti would cheat and that her illness and his guilt were the only things keeping him tethered to her. Here's what we know happened next. Elizabeth started getting sicker, thinner, paler. Friends described her as looking death-like. She would spend weeks in bed. She'd travel to the seaside to convalesce, and then she'd rally, seem better, then collapse again. And here's the pattern that emerged. When Rossetti tried to leave to work, she'd get worse. When he was with her, holding her hand, promising not to leave, she'd rally. Sometimes the recoveries were almost miraculous. In 1856, Rossetti had tried to go back to London when she was convalescing by the sea, but within days she deteriorated so badly he felt he couldn't leave her. He rushed back to her side, and then she got better. One doctor, Dr. Henry Wentworth Ackland, a friend of John Ruskin's, studied her for 2 weeks and concluded her illness was, quote, mental power long pent up and lately overtasked, end quote. Another family friend who'd spent time with her noted that her illness seemed to prevent her from doing only what other people wanted, but it rarely stopped her from doing what she actually wanted to do. Was she manipulating him? Or was the stress of his absence, the fear that he was with another woman, actually making her sicker? Even her doctors couldn't tell. I think she probably didn't start out manipulating him, but when she realized that illness was the only thing that brought him back, that made him stay, that made him feel guilty enough to be faithful, she used it. Because what else did she have? He wouldn't marry her. He wouldn't be faithful. She had no legal claim on him and no social standing as his wife. And by this point, her odds of finding another man were slim to none, as her reputation as his mistress had been firmly solidified. All she had was his guilt and his fear that she'd die. So she used it. By late 1856, they were fighting constantly. But in November, Rossetti confided to Ford Madox Brown that he really did plan to marry Elizabeth this time. He would take her to Algeria, and they'd start fresh. But just a week later, he changed his mind again. Fed up with his stringing her along, Elizabeth ran off to Bath with her sister Clara, refusing to see him. And then she became desperately ill again. When Rossetti arrived in Bath in early December to apologize and take care of her, she was too weak and frankly too relieved to turn him away. They returned to London together, but the bliss wouldn't last long. In February of 1857, they got into another huge fight. Ford Madox Brown had mentioned that the Pre-Raphaelites were planning some kind of artistic commune and that Annie Miller and William Holman Hunt were supposed to be a part of it. Elizabeth was incensed at the idea of having to live near them, and she stopped eating. Rossetti promised her again that he would marry her. He even asked Madox Brown for money for a license. Then he spent that money elsewhere. Elizabeth wouldn't allow him near her, and they didn't speak again until mid-April. And then something shifted. In May 1857, there was a Pre-Raphaelite exhibition at Fitzroy Square. Elizabeth was the only woman included. And one of her pieces was bought by an American collector named Charles Eliot Norton, who had been an acquaintance of both Ruskin and Rossetti. This should have been a triumph, but Elizabeth was falling apart. She'd been taking laudanum for years now, not just for the pain, but for anxiety, for grief, for the constant terror that Rossetti was going to leave her. And as a result, she couldn't work consistently. Ruskin was writing her letters asking where her artwork was, and she felt like a fraud taking his money when she could barely hold a pen. So she gave up his allowance, gave up her independence, gave up the thing that made her something other than Rossetti's eternal fiancé. And then she left again. In the summer of 1857, Elizabeth left not only Rossetti, but London entirely. She went north, first to Matlock in Derbyshire with one of her sisters, near the supposed ancestral Siddal lands her father had bankrupted himself trying to claim. Then she went to Sheffield to stay with her second cousins, the Ibbets. She enrolled at the Sheffield School of Art, and for a while it seemed like it might work. Her health improved, probably because she was away from Rossetti's chaos and she couldn't access laudanum as freely as she could in London. Her cousins adored her. She was making art again, and she was writing poetry. One of her cousin's sons even proposed to her. She hinted that she was already engaged, to whom she never told him, but it's clear that the engagement, if it existed, was shaky at best. We don't know much about this period. She's out of Rossetti's orbit, so she's out of the historical record. And the men who will later write about the Pre-Raphaelites don't know what she's doing, and they don't particularly care. We, in fact, know nothing about what she was doing between mid-1858 and early 1860. She may have been in Sheffield, she may have been back in London, she may have been in Scotland visiting her sister Annie, who had moved there after her marriage. During this same period, Rossetti's busy. He's fighting with his friend William Morris over Jane Burden, a model who would become Morris's wife and whom Rossetti would remain obsessed with for the rest of his life. He's also having an affair with another woman named Fanny Cornforth. And when Annie Miller becomes available again after William Holman Hunt finally ends their engagement, Rossetti competes with yet another friend for her attention too. Of Elizabeth, there's no mention. It's like she doesn't exist for him. Until April 1860, when her family tells John Ruskin that she's dying. In April 1860, Elizabeth is genuinely, terrifyingly ill. She can't keep food down, she's skeletal, she can barely move. This isn't manipulation, this is overdose. Years of laudanum use have wrecked her digestive system, and she's spiraling. Her family thinks this is it, thinks she actually could die this time. So they contact John Ruskin, and John Ruskin contacts Rossetti. Rossetti, filled with remorse and with terror, with the sudden clarity of impending loss, rushes to her bedside and promises that if she lives, he'll marry her. He'll do it properly this time. He means it. For several weeks, it's touch and go. She's vomiting daily, and the doctors aren't optimistic. But Rossetti stays, and slowly, impossibly, she begins to recover. And he keeps his promise. On May 23, 1860, they were married at St. Clement's Church in Hastings. No family, no friends, just the two of them and the required witnesses, strangers pulled in off the street. Elizabeth was so frail she had to be carried to the church, even though it was only a 5-minute walk from where they were staying. But after 10 years, Elizabeth and Rossetti were finally married. They honeymooned in Paris and Boulogne near the end of 1860, and for a little while, in the autumn and winter of that year, things were good, really good. They rented a cottage near Hampstead Heath, and Elizabeth was feeling creative again, working on drawings and paintings. She was socializing and hosting small gatherings. They had friends over constantly. The poet Algernon Swinburne became particularly close to her in this period. He would come read her poetry while Rossetti was out of the studio in Blackfriars, and he could make her laugh until she cried. Rossetti was delighted by their friendship, even though he was usually a very jealous person, because it meant he could work without feeling guilty, because Elizabeth had company. She was also pregnant. Both of them were terrified about it. Elizabeth's health had always been precarious, and pregnancy and childbirth in 1860 were dangerous for anyone, let alone someone who'd spent years dependent on laudanum and barely able to eat. But she made it through the winter, through her first trimester, and then her second. By early 1861, she was starting to believe it might actually work, that she might actually have this baby. Until April, when something went wrong. The baby stopped moving. There were no ultrasounds in 1861, no way to check on the baby without waiting for labor. When Elizabeth realized she couldn't feel movement anymore, all she could do was wait and hope she was wrong. But she wasn't. The baby had died 2 or 3 weeks before Elizabeth went into labor, which means for 2 or 3 weeks, she carried her dead daughter inside of her, the fetus's toxins leaching into her own system, making her sicker and sicker. On May 2nd, 1861, she delivered a stillborn baby girl. Rossetti wrote to his mother, quote, "Lizzie has just been delivered of a dead child. She is doing pretty well, I trust," end quote. That's how he framed it in the letters, trying to sound calm, trying to be strong. But privately, he was grieving the loss of what would have been his daughter too. And he had been terrified that Elizabeth wouldn't survive. And there was some relief in that terror, which must have made him feel monstrous. Relief that at least he hadn't lost both of them. Elizabeth didn't recover. Not really. Physically, yes, eventually. But mentally, she was gone. Friends who visited her found her staring into space, vacant. She'd rock the empty cradle sometimes, looking at visitors with confusion, telling them to be quiet so they didn't wake the baby. Postnatal depression, postnatal psychosis, grief. The Victorians didn't really have language for it. They just knew she was worse than before, more distant and more strange. And Rossetti and Ford Madox Brown both had to apologize to their friends on her behalf as if she was just ill, not suffering from something that had a specific cause and might have been treatable if anyone had cared to understand it. And she was taking more laudanum than ever. Rossetti later admitted that she'd sometimes take 100 drops in a single dose, which was a massively dangerous amount. Throughout the rest of 1861, Rossetti tried desperately to recapture their earlier happiness. He drew her constantly, sketched her obsessively, as if he could freeze her in place and keep her from slipping away. But it didn't work. By early 1862, she was pregnant again, but by February, she was dead. February 10th, 1862, Monday evening. Elizabeth and Rossetti had plans to have dinner with the poet Algernon Swinburne at La Sablonnière, one of their favorite restaurants. Around 6 in the evening, they left their home at Chatham Place in Blackfriars. Rossetti was worried before they even left. Elizabeth seemed off, drowsy, but also overexcited, fluctuating between the two. He recognized the signs. She'd taken a large dose of laudanum before leaving. He asked if she'd rather stay home, but the subtext was clear. He was worried she'd embarrass him in the restaurant. She insisted on going. At dinner, according to Swinburne, nothing unusual happened. Elizabeth was in good spirits. They had a lively meal. She seemed weak, but then she always seemed weak. They finished around 8, and Rossetti and Elizabeth took a cab back to Blackfriars. By then, the laudanum was really hitting her. Around 9, Rossetti left her in bed and went to the Working Men's College where he taught an evening class. It's been suggested by some biographers that he was actually going to meet another woman and that Elizabeth knew it, and that this betrayal is what pushed her to take the overdose. But there's no evidence for this. A friend named Val Prinsep insisted Rossetti was faithful during their marriage, and his teaching schedule is documented. What's more likely is that Elizabeth, increasingly paranoid from years of addiction and justified suspicion from years of his earlier affairs, convinced herself he was going to meet someone else, even if he wasn't. The other possibility is that she knew something had gone wrong again with her second pregnancy, and she couldn't bear to handle that reality one more time. When Rossetti returned home at 11:30, he found Elizabeth unconscious, snoring loudly and disturbingly. The laudanum bottle beside the bed had been half full that morning. It was empty now. And there was a note pinned to her nightgown, saying, "Please look after Harry." Harry was Elizabeth's youngest brother, and he had an intellectual disability. So the note was asking Rossetti to make sure he was taken care of after she was gone. It was a suicide note. Rossetti ripped it off, shoved it in his pocket, and screamed for help. Dr. Francis Hutchinson arrived first. He lived on nearby Bridge Street, and he'd treated Elizabeth before, including attending the stillbirth, so he knew her history. When he pumped her stomach and smelled the contents, the smell of laudanum was overwhelming. He tried everything: the stomach pump, washing out her stomach. Nothing worked. So Rossetti called a second doctor, then a third, then a fourth. 4 doctors working through the night, trying to revive her. She never regained consciousness. At some point in the early morning hours, Rossetti ran to Ford Madox Brown's house in Kentish Town. When they were alone, he showed Ford the note. And then Ford Madox Brown threw it in the fire. They agreed never to mention it. Suicide at the time was illegal, and it was deeply shameful. It would prevent Elizabeth from being buried in consecrated ground, which would devastate her religious family. And it would ruin both families' reputations. So they burned the evidence. Elizabeth's siblings, Clara and James, arrived around 3 a.m. from Southwark, having rushed over as soon as they got the message. They held her hands, they talked to her, but she never responded. At 7:20 on the morning of February 11th, 1862, all 4 doctors pronounced her dead. She was 32 years old. She was pregnant, and she had killed herself. There had to be an inquest. The law required it for sudden deaths. On Thursday, February 13th, an inquest was held at Bridewell Hospital. Dante Rossetti, Algernon Swinburne, Clara Siddal, their landlady Sarah Barrell and her daughter Catherine, and a neighbor named Ellen McIntyre all gave testimony. Everyone was nervous. Even without knowing about the note, people suspected suicide. Their neighbor, Ellen McIntyre, testified that she'd been with Elizabeth around 8:30 the night she died, and that Elizabeth had seemed cheerful, but that she'd also once said to Ellen that, quote, she had taken quarts of laudanum in her time, end quote. Quarts. That's not medical use. That's addiction. So Rossetti, trying to steer the coroner away from suicide, added that, quote, she had not spoken of wishing to die. She had contemplated going out of town in a day or two and had ordered a new mantle which she intended to wear on the occasion, end quote. Look, she was making plans. She bought a coat. She wasn't suicidal. Her sister Clara said that she, quote, seemed intolerably good spirits when she had seen her the previous Saturday. She confirmed the laudanum use, but didn't suspect foul play. Notably, she didn't say she didn't suspect Elizabeth of harming herself. Sarah Burrell, the landlady, said she'd known Elizabeth for 9 years and had lived in the house since they'd married. She knew Elizabeth kept laudanum under her pillow. But then she added, perhaps fearing Rossetti would be accused, that, quote, I know of no hurt to her, nor don't suspect any. Her husband and herself lived very comfortably together, end quote. Ultimately, the coroner ruled it an accidental death. This wasn't necessarily surprising. In 1861, there were 80 recorded accidental deaths from laudanum in Britain, and in 1864, there would be 95. So accidental overdose was common enough to be plausible. This meant Elizabeth was free to be buried in the Rossetti family plot at Highgate Cemetery, next to Rossetti's father, Gabriel, whom she'd never met. The funeral was February 17th. It was open casket. Rossetti reportedly stood over her coffin, begging her to come back, insisting that something could still be done. He called another surgeon, a friend of Ford Madox Brown's, certain that there must be some way to revive her. But there wasn't. Before they closed the coffin, Rossetti placed a manuscript inside. That notebook of poems she'd asked him to have bound in gray calf leather. He tucked it beside her with a note, saying that since she was gone, he had no more use for them. For years after her death, Rossetti was haunted. Literally, he claimed. He told his doctor and his family that her ghost visited him every night and that she was not at peace, that he could feel her presence, angry, suffering, unable to rest. He couldn't stay at their home at Chatham Place, so he moved in with Swinburne in Cheyne Walk in Chelsea, a fashionable riverside area that, ironically, would have been so much better for Elizabeth's health if they had lived there when she was alive. Nevertheless, her ghost followed him. He started attending seances with Swinburne and his brother William and their friend William Bell Scott. They all became convinced they could communicate with spirits. Once, Rossetti became certain her soul had migrated into a bird, a specific chaffinch whose song he was sure contained her voice. He was descending into addiction himself, chloral and alcohol, into paranoia, into the kind of obsession that eats you from the inside. And he kept painting her, over and over. But not necessarily as she'd been in those last terrible years. He was painting her as he wished she'd remained. The painting that would become his masterpiece, that he worked on throughout the 1860s, was called Beata Beatrix, Blessed Beatrice. In it, Elizabeth sits with her eyes closed, her face tilted up, lost in ecstasy or prayer or death. It's impossible to tell which. A dove flies toward her carrying a white poppy in its beak. Behind her, you can see two figures, Dante Alighieri and a representation of love. There's a sundial marking the passage of time, and a bridge, which may be the Ponte Vecchio from Dante's Florence, or it may be the Blackfriars Bridge from their London home. It's beautiful. It's one of the most iconic Pre-Raphaelite paintings, and it became the image that most people thought of when they thought of Elizabeth Siddal outside of Ophelia. But look closer at that white poppy. White poppies are the source of opium, and therefore of laudanum. The dove, which was his nickname for her, and the symbol of peace and the Holy Spirit, is bringing her the thing that killed her. And that expression on her face, that ecstasy, is it spiritual transcendence, or is it the look of an addict getting her fix? Rossetti made 6 replicas of this painting over the next 10 years. It was hugely popular. Everyone wanted a Beata Beatrix. He was selling her death over and over. And that brings us back to where we started. October 1869, Highgate Cemetery, the exhumation. Howell's lie about her preserved body and her glowing copper hair filling the coffin. The recovered manuscript. In 1870, Rossetti published poems. They were mostly poems about physical passion. People assumed they were about Elizabeth, and some critics thought he was sullying her memory by publishing such sensual work. They were, in reality, mostly about other women, about Jane Morris, about his various affairs. But Elizabeth's ghost was useful for selling books, and so the story persevered. The tragic muse inspiring poetry even from beyond the grave. After Rossetti died in 1882, Elizabeth became newly visible. 2 exhibitions in 1883 featured Rossetti's work. At the Royal Academy, they showed Beata Beatrix, misdated to make it seem like it was painted immediately after her death to heighten the tragedy. They also showed How They Met Themselves, a painting of 2 lovers confronted by their own ghostly doubles. Premonition, fate, death foreshadowed. The Burlington Fine Arts Club had a larger exhibition, 150 paintings with an essay by Henry Virtue Tebbs, the solicitor who'd been present at the exhumation. Suddenly, people could see Elizabeth from all angles in all ages. And the story that emerged was drenched in aestheticism and decadence, the literary movements of the 1880s and 90s that were obsessed with death, with pale women as figures of destruction, and with pleasurable pain. Elizabeth became an erotic ghost story in a beautiful wraith, a figure of death and desire. Writers like Baudelaire and Beardsley, movements like symbolism, created what scholars called a pictorial cult of decadence, pale women destroying what they desire and being destroyed by desire. Elizabeth fit perfectly into this narrative. In 1896, Oscar Wilde went to prison, and there was a cultural backlash against aestheticism. The cult of Elizabeth Siddal as a beautiful wraith declined somewhat. And then, at the turn of the century, as other members of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood got old and started publishing their memoirs, Elizabeth's reputation shifted again. William Bell Scott published his memoirs in 1892, posthumously, which gave him the freedom to be cruel. He told a story about visiting Rossetti's studio unannounced in 1852 and finding him alone with a woman that Scott didn't recognize. Rossetti didn't introduce her, and she left without speaking. It was Elizabeth, and the implication was clear. Something improper was happening. Scott also mentioned that John Ruskin was giving Elizabeth an allowance, which would have been inappropriate if she was Rossetti's fiancé. He suggested that maybe she was playing both men, or that the relationship was more transactional than romantic. It wasn't clear, but either way, it was ugly. So the story started to shift. Maybe she wasn't a tragic muse. Maybe she was a social climber, a manipulator, an addict who brought her own problems on herself. By the early 20th century, she was being described as, quote, morbid, hysterical, a suicidal woman clinging to her virginity and angrily jealous of her rivals, end quote. And then came the 1920s, when Freud's ideas were filtering into popular culture and the sex war was the lens through which people understood everything. Suddenly, Elizabeth Siddal had a new diagnosis: sexually frigid. The theory went like this. Elizabeth refused to have sex with Rossetti before marriage, and this was the reason he cheated. His Southern blood, because they always emphasized his Italian heritage when talking about his sexuality, required satisfaction, and she wouldn't give it to him. So he was driven into the arms of Annie Miller, Fanny Cornforth, and others. And his guilt over his infidelity made him unable to marry her because marriage would have meant admitting his betrayal. She was reframed as hysterical, neurotic, sexually withholding, a woman who weaponized her virginity and then her illness. Violet Hunt, of relation to William Holman Hunt, published a biography in 1932 called The Wife of Rossetti that Rossetti's niece, Helen, later called, quote, gleanings from the pre-Raphaelite wastepaper bins, end quote. It was full of scandal, innuendo, and the assertion that Elizabeth's frigidity destroyed Rossetti's life. This version stuck for decades. Mid-century biographers repeated it as fact. Elizabeth Siddal, frigid shrew, drove her husband to infidelity and then killed herself out of jealous spite. But here's what's fascinating, is there's no real evidence for this. There's no diary entry, no letter where she discusses sex or marriage or her boundaries. This interpretation is based entirely on Victorian-era assumptions about propriety and 1920s anxieties about female sexuality. Modern scholars think the opposite is probably true, that they did have a sexual relationship before marriage and that this is why he could afford not to marry her for so long, that she kept hoping marriage would come once he got his finances in order and felt betrayed when it didn't. The evidence points to them staying together at his Chatham Place residence, sometimes with him and sometimes by herself, which would have been an enormous social risk if nothing physical was happening. But for 40 years, she was buried as a frigid hysteric. Post-World War II, there was a conscious break with the Victorian past, and the Pre-Raphaelites became costume drama, lurid and embarrassing. And then in the 1960s, Elizabeth becomes a proto-groupie, a model scouted off the street, long-haired, loose-living, drug-taking, working class. She was reframed as the swinging 60s before there was a swinging 60s, a girl who used her looks to climb the social ladder and who slept with artists, who partied too hard and died young. Ken Russell made a TV film called Dante's Inferno in 1967. Elizabeth, played by Judith Paris, was pure 1960s fantasy, the beautiful young thing destroyed by the art world. This version was more sympathetic than the frigid shrew version, but it still robbed her of agency. She was a victim of circumstance, a flower child crushed by Victorian morality and masculine genius. By mid-century generally, she'd become something of a pre-Raphaelite groupie, the term that was actually used to describe her. Then the 1980s brought feminism in theory to Pre-Raphaelite studies. Finally, scholars started asking, what about the women? What about the models, the wives, the artists who got erased? Elizabeth was exhumed again, this time as either a victim of patriarchal oppression or a proto-feminist trying to assert her own artistic identity. Some scholars emphasized how the Pre-Raphaelites used her, how Rossetti controlled her, how she was trapped by addiction and financial dependence, a pure victim narrative. Others emphasized her ambition, her artistic talent, her attempts at independence, like that obituary that suggests she approached the School of Design herself. They tried to separate her from Rossetti, to give her a biography of her own. Both approaches had merit, and both had problems. The victim narrative robbed her of agency again, made her purely passive, purely suffering. The feminist narrative sometimes overcorrected, making her more assertive and successful than the evidence really supports. And now, here we are, in 2025, still trying to figure out who Elizabeth Siddal was. So, who was she? Here's what we know for certain. She was born Elizabeth Eleanor Siddal on July 25, 1829, in London. She worked as a milliner's assistant. She became a model for the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood around 1850, although we don't know exactly how that happened. She had red gold hair, pale skin, and a thin build. By conventional 1850s standards, she wasn't beautiful, but she would go on to change what beauty meant. She posed for some of the most iconic paintings of the 19th century. Ophelia floating in the water, flowers in her hair. That's her. The image that has become so embedded in popular culture that it just seems to people that that's what Ophelia looks like. She was an artist herself, drawing, painting, writing poetry. John Ruskin believed she had genius. Some of her work influenced the direction Pre-Raphaelitism would take, though this fact has been largely erased from art history. She had a relationship with Dante Gabriel Rossetti for 10 years before they married. The relationship was passionate, toxic, and characterized by his infidelity and her increasing illness and addiction. She was addicted to laudanum. She suffered from depression. She may have had a chronic digestive disorder, or the digestive problems may have been caused by the addiction, or some combination of both. She married Rossetti in May 1860, and in May 1861, she delivered a stillborn daughter. In February 1862, she took a fatal overdose of laudanum while she was pregnant again. She was buried at Highgate Cemetery, and 7 years later, her coffin was opened to retrieve a manuscript. Now, here's what we don't know. Whether she approached the Pre-Raphaelites herself or was discovered by them. Whether she and Rossetti were formally engaged, and if so, when. Whether they had a sexual relationship before marriage or they didn't. What specific illness she suffered from beyond addiction and depression. Whether her death was suicide or accidental overdose. Legally, it was ruled accidental, but the destroyed note suggests otherwise. Whether her life would have gone another way if Rossetti could have only been faithful to her and married her years earlier than he did. And here's what we'll probably never know. What she actually thought. What she felt. Who she was when she wasn't being looked at, painted about, interpreted. Every account of her life comes filtered through someone else. We don't really have surviving letters of her own. We have Rossetti's letters, his brother William's memoirs and biographies, friends' diaries, obituaries, biographies written decades or a century after her death. We do have the poetry she left behind. 14 poems survive. They're sad, haunted, obsessed with death and lost love. One's called Dead Love, another's called The Lust of the Eyes. They're good, actually. Spare and strange and genuinely affecting. Her sister-in-law Christina described them as almost too hopelessly sad. But even the poems have been interpreted 1,000 different ways. Are they about Rossetti? About addiction? About her own depression? Are they confessional, or are they a persona? We don't know. So when you ask me who Elizabeth Siddal was, the honest answer is, I don't know. None of us do. We have fragments. We have hundreds of images, thanks to Rossetti's obsessive documentation of her face. We have 14 poems. We have some of her drawings, though we can't always be sure which ones are entirely hers and which ones Rossetti touched up or finished. But we don't have her voice. Not really. What we have is a century and a half of people deciding who she must have been based on what their era needed her to be. And now, what do we need her to be? Maybe we're finally ready to let her be complicated, to admit that we don't know, to stop exhuming her and making her into whatever serves our narrative. Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we're just doing it again. Maybe the 2020s need her to be unknowable, to be a meditation on how history erases women's voices. Maybe that's our version of the lie, the way we're using her to make ourselves feel enlightened. I keep thinking about Ophelia. The painting, Millais' painting of Elizabeth as Ophelia floating in the water surrounded by flowers. Ophelia in Shakespeare's play goes mad after Hamlet rejects her and after her father dies. She makes garlands of flowers and falls into a brook. She floats there singing until her clothes become waterlogged and pull her under. There's debate in the play about whether it's suicide or accidental drowning, whether she let herself drown or whether she couldn't help it. And in the painting, she's just gone, eyes open but unseeing, still beautiful but already dead, already becoming part of the water, the flowers, the landscape. Elizabeth Siddal posed for that painting in 1852 when she was 22 years old. 10 years later, she'd be dead, drowned in a way. Not in water, but in laudanum, in addiction, in grief, in the weight of a legend that had already started to form around her. And ever since, she's been floating in the river of history surrounded by flowers, beautiful, tragic, perfect in depth, while we stand on the banks trying to figure out whether she jumped or she fell. And maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe the question isn't, was she a victim or did she have agency? Maybe it's not, was she a great artist or just a muse? Maybe it's not even, did she kill herself or was it an accident? Maybe the question is, why do we keep digging her up? What are we looking for in her grave? Every generation needs its tragic dead women. We need someone to mythologize, to romanticize, and project our anxieties onto. Someone whose beauty and youth and suffering can mean something, teach us something, can make us feel sophisticated for caring about her. And Elizabeth Siddal, with her red hair and her Ophelia dress and her doomed romance and her addiction and her poetry and her paintings and her mysterious illness and her pregnant suicide or accidental overdose, she's perfect for it. She has everything we need for the story, except for her own voice telling us what actually happened. So we keep writing and rewriting her, keep exhuming her and examining her bones and putting her back in the ground, slightly rearranged, ready for the next generation to dig her up and decide she means something different. And maybe that's the real tragedy. Not that she died young or that she was addicted or depressed or caught in a toxic relationship. Those things are all tragic, of course, but they're human. People suffer and struggle, and sometimes people don't make it. But the tragedy is that she can't rest, that 163 years later, we're still using her, still making her mean things, still turning her into lessons and symbols and cautionary tales and inspiration and whatever else we need her to be. The tragedy is that she's been more useful to history as a myth than she ever was as a person. I don't know who Elizabeth Siddal was. I don't think anyone does, and I don't think we ever will. But she deserved better than she got. In life, yes, but also in death. Instead, she's the woman who can't stay dead. Forever drowning, forever watching us watch her, forever unable to tell us what she sees. This episode was written, narrated, and produced by me, Emma Laramie. If you enjoyed this story, if something here surprised you or made you think differently or just gave you something interesting to talk to your friends about over drinks, do me a favor. Follow the show. Leave a rating or a review if you're feeling generous. And if there's an artist or moment in art history you're curious about, drop me a comment below. And honestly, in whatever way you can engage with this podcast would mean more than you could ever know. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.